I guess just like as a minor update. So I'm still giving a presentation in 2 weeks' time in Tampa at the Opus
Yes.
kind of
Haha.
arts festival thing. And I was kind of spinning in my head two different ideas on how to give a talk. And
Mm-hmm.
one was more conceptual, I guess, which is what I was more interested in doing. The other being, after talking with my wife about that idea, she suggested it's probably better just to talk about your portfolio and your history and your interests and your methods. Your more straightforward artist presentation, and I wasn't sure about that, but then I talked to the head of the group, and they said it's probably best if you did that, if you actually gave that straightforward portfolio presentation. So that's what I'm going to be doing.
Oh.
But yeah, so
Well,
I'm going to be educating people on why comics, what's interesting about comics, what makes it a separate, a distinct medium from books or TV and stuff like that. So
uh-huh.
it's gonna be interesting.
Yeah, I think us artists, like, we find ourselves in a I kind of referenced it before you came on, this like purgatory of of a business, and how it's this interesting kind of uh thing where we want to represent why we're passionate about the art that we're passionate about, but there's also something in connecting that to what you've done, and kind of like the like telling, like, my program director back at LaSalle talked about it as like sharing your story, and like business
Yeah.
people to see, like, how you kind of meted out that vision that you have of what you're doing. Um, and so recently, like that, going to Evil Expo, um, it was kind of this weird thing where, obviously, like, I had fun just going to this convention where I was seeing some of the uh, trends of like metal and goth and stuff having this kind of like resurgence recently,
Sure. Yeah.
inspiring somebody that had a more like sci-fi fantasy convention series going, transitioning to this like goth and metal, like like twinged convention. And so everybody there was kind of enthused about that stuff, but then it was also like all of us trying to connect like this story to our brand, and so people had like varying levels of success with that, but also seemed to really be still interested in the convention itself. And so, like, by the time it was over, my sister and I were kind of saying, like, well, maybe this doesn't fit our brand. We might have fun going to this convention. But it's kind of an interesting thing because as artists, we're very passionate about things, and we kind of like to see things in black and white, but it doesn't always work with, marketing yourself. And so it kind of comes to uh, uh, a place of, reckoning how best to translate what you're doing to a different, varying audiences, and trying to find your audience versus, somebody else's audience.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very true. I heard on there's a guy, David Stewart, who's writing tips on YouTube I enjoy a lot. He says that your audience is not are not your friends, and it's not the influencer circle that you're trying to be a part of. That's also not your market. I can kind of see that might be a little strong, because sometimes I think getting the recognition from your peers is part of the pathway to reaching that market. But I guess that's probably not what he's saying. Like, primarily, you're not trying to sell to people who are actually doing things within your genre. for your market. You're trying to reach the people that they're also reaching, I guess, if that sort of makes
Right.
sense. Sometimes we
Yeah.
get in the habit of focusing on fellow creators and trying to win connections with them when we should be kind of like facing parallel, I guess, outward towards the shared, you know, the market that's out there, the demographic that's out there, not necessarily the people that we're fans of, I guess, if that sort of makes sense. And that could go for conventions too. Maybe we can just be fans of conventions, but they're not our market, I guess.
Well, I think that's what we'll kind of get into more in the meat of this, because I wanted to kind of discuss our journey of how we discovered the books that we like, and then what we're kind of thinking about with where the market is right now. Because and I'm super interested, considering like you come from that being a fan of comics that are kind of different, like considering there are a bunch of European comics that you like, and there are some creators
I'm
here.
told it's called independent is what people are called. I just call it comics, anything but non-superheroes, but I'm told that that's called independent.
Well, that's an interesting thing to bring up, because that is certainly, there are certain styles that influence people, and then we think of we tend to conflate fringe and independent in terms of like there's independent as a technical marketing term, where it's like comics not published by Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, whatever the big 5 or 8 you can consider. But then there's the stylistic term of somebody trying to challenge the medium with something new and fresh and different, and that can be their own kind of thing where like they don't necessarily like cite their influences, or it can be something where they're directly influenced by something that just isn't as popular in America. And so like I come at it that way because my introduction to independent comics here was through Image, which quickly became one of the new old guard in the sense that like it became such a big player that while it still like sells creator owned comics now, it is now a trendsetter, and so it doesn't necessarily have that stylistic connotation of an indie in that it tries to necessarily push the envelope. Case in point, I got Stellar in the bundle of comics that my friend gave me.
I like the cover.
Yeah, the cover is really cool. And it's the art was really pretty interesting. But I read this Silencer by published by DC.
Oh, cool.
And they both kind of had very similar thematic things in the sense like it was kind of like a modern Jekyll and Hyde thing where these two like stellar interstellar police like military police people are recovering from this like past life of some kind of like genocide or some kind of like weird like it was that like sins of the past trope, and it was interesting to see how with this DC metal imprint that Silencer is a part of, you're getting kind of that grittier influence into the DC universe, and it was interesting to see that kind of like correlation, reading them like back to back, seeing how similar it was. But anyway, going back to the storefront thing, my story is pretty much getting into Marvel comics, and then when Walking Dead got big, getting into The Walking Dead, but Walking
Definitely.
Dead being kind of a that was my gateway drug to just looking for independent as style. That like this is not superhero comics anymore. I'm starting to branch out because I had flirted with that whole Alan Moore deconstruction type of thing back when I was in high school. I went to an art school, so there was different types of comics that were I was exposed to there.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of looking for independent comics, looking for something that wasn't superhero and wasn't, the trade thing that the big two had been training me to seek out.
Yeah.
Walking Dead was that, and then I noticed, oh, there's this whole other section that living in Philadelphia and having a lot of experimental arts in general
Oh, sure.
is kind of promoted. Like if you go to, there are several comic stores here. If you can make it out to them, they will have those. But then that leads me all the way to, in the past few years, noticing that there is, as a result of Comicsgate, as a result just of the market, um, opening up on Amazon and Kickstarter, Indiegogo, that there
Yeah.
are all these different people getting supported for their, projects, and it's kind of like a Wild West now. It feels like.
Yeah. Well, my experience has been that I guess crowdfunded comics, which is really, I mean, that's as indie as you can get, I guess.
Mm.
Uh, there's nothing new to that because Kickstarter's been around for 10 years or something now, and Indiegogo's been around for longer than Comicsgate as well. But there's been like a perfect, I guess the stars aligned in a way where easy streaming YouTube content, I guess, matched up with a cultural sense of, like we've talked about before, of decentralizing the culture, I guess, and people kind of finding local communities that kind of agreed with their outlook across the interwebs and not necessarily tuning into traditional media formats to get that. And maybe in tuning out of their local comic stores to get comics, and then also just already having the pre-established, like the well-trodden crowdfunding format already available. I feel like is kind of what let CG become CG, I guess, But yeah, because that's how people are finding these comics. They're not finding it by already being into crowdfunding per se. They're into it because most people came from disenfranchised from like the big two and found YouTube, and then through YouTube found indie comics, which is a great. I mean, more power to them. That's a great way to do it. But they've come over from this thing was happening for years and they didn't know about this, and now they do, and for that I'm glad. But yeah, I don't know. That's just my caveat I was going to throw in.
No,
not to derail you though. You still had points to make. So.
No, I tend to make everything I'm saying sound like it's going to be a 5-paragraph essay, but
it's fine.
But I agree that like it's not just the comics medium that has become revolutionized by digital. It's like every type of like market that you can have in terms of the entertainment industry, that you have streaming that opens up what we thought TV could be, and so now you have that affecting what gets airplay, and then what gets airplay turns to what in the print forms and in the new kind of like blended genres of like I've experimented with tapas like you have in the past. We're all trying to kind of find out where print is in the confluence of audiobooks and those types of new ways of digesting books. All those things are kind of flurrying together in this perfect storm of digital being something that is revolutionizing how you digest entertainment in general.
Yeah, sure.
But I'm also interested in terms of Comicsgate, seeing that you kind of found that, like, in a, it's kind of hard to necessarily dissect how you come across, but to the best of your knowledge, would you think that the Comicsgate um, introduced you to different things that comics could do that you were thinking maybe, there was some kind of pessimism about what it was capable of doing, or do you think that is that to you, based on your experience before, there were just things maybe that people got more access to them. They were happening, but there's just more of an opportunity for those things.
Very good question. I think, honestly, I think Comicsgate exposed me to the big two for the first time, really. So learning what that legacy has been able to explore and embellish over the decades, and what writers and creators and readers of that legacy have grown up with and learned to appreciate, and what their standards are in terms of quality storytelling, comic storytelling is. That's what I've been exposed to. So I guess you could say, like, I've seen by listening and and reading and seeing, like, what CG thinks quality. Well, I don't. Well, it's funny because I guess there's the commentary version of CG that's predominantly interested in talking about superhero stuff, because that's what, if you're not independent, you're big too, I guess, in the US. But a lot of their creations are not superhero stories, so I found that interesting. And the only way I can square that circle is people aren't going to like this, but it's more the peculiarities of the US market, where there's a predominant there's two companies that own the lion's share of the market, and that wasn't naturally the case until a few decades ago. And they've managed to build an audience that's interested in only this one genre that both of them are putting out, which is kind of an artificial limit to what the comics medium can do. But I think it's interesting that those same people who have grown up and appreciated comics for what they have done over the decades, when they find themselves in the driving seat, as it were, and are creating their own content, they're finding that whether I don't know, it doesn't seem like that. Some of them are more conscious of it than others, but they can tell any kind of story that they feel like, and and we kind of talked about that last week, but they're I guess they're applying, which is something that they've taught me, I guess, is they're applying the classical heroic genre of individuals standing up for justice in the face of existential threats to humanity. Like because that would be one way you could kind of describe superheroes without saying superheroes.
Right.
They've kind of applied that to new genre, or to different genres, which I think is interesting. And so they're showing me how you can do the superhero genre without superheroes, I guess you could say. I think most CG stories are not superhero. It's superhero genre. I mean, it's superheroes without capes, I guess, which is interesting. So that's something I've kind of learned. But the indie scene, by definition, has always been pretty free politically and genre-wise, and types of storytelling wise.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think there's always been a mix on Kickstarter, and, and I mean the only thing that got complicated for CG was their YouTube platform, making it easier for I guess for people to discriminate against them. But uh, yeah, like growing up with comics that were not from the big two or are not coming out of the local comic store market.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I was always kind of finding stuff that fit, stuff that challenged me and stuff that I didn't necessarily agree with, but I appreciated, and things that I did find kind of rewarding personally. But you just kind of have to look outside of the the market that's been artificially uh, weighted in one particular direction to find that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know.
and I feel
That's
like
my rambling
that
answer.
feeling of it being an artificial direction was something that, having been educated, having my reading education come from uh, the Bible and Shakespeare and uh, some things like some classics like H.G. Wells, uh, author The Invisible Man, and
Sure.
20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, those types of things. Um, it was interesting to see, like you're saying, the definition of heroism be broadened and, in some sense, allow for the type of pulp fiction that was happening in the 1800s to come back in some respects. Um, you have voices like,
Hmm.
um, Alan Moore with the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, like that type of hero, rather than being an exception to the rule, was kind of like, oh, you can do whatever type of hero you want because this is
Yeah.
a new, uh, the dawn of a new era in terms of how you can use comics to tell a story.
Yeah. Sure.
I think that was a good, your definition is a good workable one for creators out there.
Hmm.
I wanted to introduce, interestingly enough, another thing that came through in this comics extravaganza that my friend treated me to. Um, he, I think he was just kind of trying to get all these comics off his hands. But it did give me a little bit of a reference to hits that I've been unprivy to recently, and one of those is Lumberjanes.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
With
Sure.
the first issue too. Um,
Hmm.
and it's interesting because another part of my comics journey was getting into web comics, um, which I would say within the last 6 years or so,
Hmm.
I started reading Penny Arcade, and then because of my esoteric bent, I was more drawn to the Acquisitions Inc., which is their podcast they do of their Dungeons and Dragons
Oh,
playthrough.
cool. That's
And
neat.
what's interesting is that uh, they also do a print comic with Dark Horse called Lookouts, which is kind of like pretty much just this, but with
Oh, really?
boys. um,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because it goes back to this phenomenon recently that I feel like is being fueled by the fact that like people aren't necessarily as taken back by weird things as they were like in the 90s and early 2000s. Um,
Yeah.
in
Sure.
that Lovecraft has like been reborn within
Oh,
fans
yeah.
in a big way, and like the I don't know if you could read the subtitle to this, but it's "Beware the Kitten Holy," um, and some of the
Hmm.
creatures in here have like third eyes on them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's interesting because it doesn't necessarily seem to be like an earnest representation of that, in the sense that like this is like like my sister always kind of complains about that, like the characters in these stories are supposed to be like driven insane. Like you don't get a Lovecraft story without the main character trying to scientifically discover something and then being a drooling idiot by the end of the story. Um, so I'm interested in what your opinion is of the resurgence of this, and if there's anything you can tell, being more versed in that indie scene maybe than I am, like what might have inspired that, and if it was something underground that I wasn't aware of.
Well, I've been wondering about Lovecraft too, specifically, and I have to wonder when his content became public domain, and if that just
Oh,
turned the corner in the last 10
good,
years or so.
that's a good theory.
Because it could just be a coincidence as simple as that. But I feel like in general, and we might have spoken about this in the past. I think we did, but I think there's a cultural trend towards a post secular culture where I think people got something out of their system in terms of varying traditional religions that they pushed away from in the 90s and 2000s. And now they're interested in what can we replace that sense of the sublime or the existentially terrifying or the well, that sort of thing with, and they're exploring different it ends up being historic ways of, like Lovecraft, of kind of manifesting that, I guess. So there's vampires, there's zombies, it's different ways of kind of
definitely
that,
I second that emotion. Because that there's kind of different levels of it, and like you're saying, there is this seemingly there are people waiting with bated breath to reinvigorate certain properties, and there's various levels of whether that is something that's earnest or something that is more on the level of people will know this, so at least I can build on something if I'm trying to get that sweet money. But I think you've glommed onto something that has been interesting for me to try to explore, where there's especially like I'm kind of working on the White Devil thing. I don't know whether that is going to live permanently on the Tapas platform, because as I finally came up with what the main thrust of it is, I don't know if it works in a pulp format, because it's interesting. Specifically my writing like rhythm has become more, okay, I need this to work as a short story first, because I tend to struggle with dumping exposition in the first part of a story and making myself like the story, because it's like sufficiently coherent in its philosophy, and then building on like that as
that's
like
tricky.
Distilled like truth bomb. So all that to say that since I've gotten to that point, I'm standing at somewhat of a crossroads. But I think in terms of that, the pulp, like in terms of the Lovecraft being something that is it's something that sits at the intersection of a lot of different conversations you have. The numinous qualities of life that somebody like C.S. Lewis talks about as something that you can't kind of shake off with rationality. You have the finitude of rationality to explain itself, I guess, to be an answer within itself. And you also have somewhat of a like you're saying, this more of like a dimension of how you can, as I've kind of discussed with what Peterson likes to do with some more of these philosophical topics, you have a kind of like using that as a proxy to talk about their, because, okay, so you can take just the fact that knowledge is finite as a means by which you can explain how others are operating in bad faith,
Yeah.
in their arguments, and it seems like there are very nihilist works like True Detective that use like that as a platform to talk about evil, but aren't necessarily discussing what the positive part of that equation is. And
Yeah.
that's
Sure.
that's something that has I've been interested in exploring, and sharing kind of like what the Inklings talk about, because it seems like both of them, both C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and I think Chesterton in Orthodoxy talks about this a little bit, that there's this um, interest that they have of showing the light at the end of the tunnel, and they're not
Yeah.
necessarily going to argue that there is no tunnel that we're going through, but it seems like there are some authors, artists, publishers that are only interested in feeling out what the tunnel looks like and aren't necessarily too interested in explaining what the light that they may be somewhat aware of is like in concrete terms. So
Yeah. Which is always, I feel like it's kind of the depressing. I mean, you can't really tell someone who suffers from chronic depression to just think their way out of it. But I feel like there's a chronic depression in our culture, at least, where um, logically speaking, we're able to, like, we, speaking as the culture, we can see the pop culture, at least. Uh, we have enough logic in our heads to be able to measure and evaluate the state of things and to see that it's lacking and that it should be better. We can compare it against an ideal that we've never seen or tasted or touched or been to or experienced, and we know uh, abstract truth exists basically, but we can't bring ourselves to because of the state that we're in. We can't bring ourselves to actually explore what that could possibly mean beyond, because we've already kind of bought into, like we've talked about in the past, these sort of these built-in Western consumerist assumptions about what is happiness. Happiness is defined economically,
mm-hmm.
so I need to become a socialist. Or happiness is defined in terms of freedom merely,
Mm-hmm.
so I have to be an anarchist or some kind of, you know, uh, uh, like a mere libertarian, I guess I could say. Speaking as a libertarian, I would say mere libertarianism is just freedom for its own sake, which is
Mm-hmm.
doesn't solve problems either. And I think we're all just kind of spinning, we're circling the drain in a way until
Mm-hmm.
things change around. And the human spirit is unquenchable, so I'm sure something else will. I don't think we're circling the drain in the sense of we're going to find a permanent end to culture in the near future. It's going to
No,
evolve into something else.
that's good. That's a good summary of that. The
Yeah.
that because that's something that I had brought up a little bit last episode, that
Yeah.
I appreciate that Randy Alcorn talks about with his kind of summary of um, this idea that we want to um, look at the shadows on the wall of the cave as being um, this evidence that we're trapped in the cave and that there's no getting out.
Yeah.
And there are both spiritual combatants that we come across, and our own flesh also kind of wants to confirm that, oh, this is a trap that you're not gonna get out of, and he wants to kind of use that, or at least embellish the Christoplatonism that we find ourselves in this kind of endless circle in, and draw us to the idea of Christ being a freedom from that. And he kind of makes the case that heaven is that quenching that we're all yearning for. And it's less an unattainable spiritual state, in that it has no connection at all to where we are now, and that it tends to be what we think of it as, tends to be what we educate people in the church to believe at times. But there is and it's something that I connect to what the Inklings have taught me, in terms of there is a Grey Havens, and there is a a place where the Emperor reigns, and his reign is uncontested. And it's kind of brought me to something that I'm thinking could be a slogan that we use, considering we're both interested in philosophical discussion and not necessarily browbeating people into a in one singular argument to basically have some kind of digital or conversational fiefdom that we erect every time we get into a conversation. That I kind of have been using on the Strider Etsy and elsewhere where we are, of uncommon good for the common man. And it's something that I feel led to use, in the sense that through much thought and much conversation, it seems like people are interested in the uncommon goodness of God, and they aren't ready to necessarily surrender that there is a great spirit that reveals things even today. But it is still contested ground that that we're continuously fighting to reveal to people. No, the kingdom of God is right now, and you can have uncommon good right now in your everyday life, and there can be that breaking into the norm, that I feel like with this boon in independent publishing, you're able to kind of talk about in a more rich level. That seems to me is kind of happening en masse, and so I'm kind of interested in Lovecraft, in the sense that it seems to be about the spiritual breaking into the everyday. But I'm also kind of looking at it as like there's a lot of Aristotelian thought around. You might be like unable to comprehend what the unimaginable is, and whatever that single category that you're trying to find out, this is the most virtuous hope that I can have, and I want to have that hope, but I know I'm not going to have it in its totality now, and that can kind of break your mind. But that's what makes the Inklings' assertion that orthodoxy is something that just kind of is a grace given to you, that I find very liberating. So that's kind of what I'm thinking would be a good banner to work under. But it is, and I feel like the ability to encourage people that knowledge is something that you can actually have, and it's not something that you can totally have, but it's not. It shouldn't feel like a burden. The fact that we have so much access to so much data now, it can seem at times overwhelming, but it is something that is an advantage that it's a common grace that we have, that we can know, what the president is thinking sometimes, and things as crass as that are something that we can just take for granted. But we do have a lot of transparency and things of that nature.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that data has never been more democratized and accessible than now, but also storytelling is in an absolute boom across all the different media, and the more people have access to data, like the internet, or their local cinema or their bookstore or something like that, the more they're spending their time and money there, which I think is pretty interesting. So it's not just about quantifying, and it never will be for humans. It's not just about quantifying the world, and I think people tend to, when they're stuck in their the chronic fatigue and sometimes depression that our culture seems to periodically be in, it can start to get the false impression that knowledge is about collecting data, when watching the actions of human beings, including ourselves, from day to day, it's much more than merely collecting data. It's about collecting understanding, which I think is usually done through narrative formats, I guess, if that sort of makes sense. Which is what politics is.
It is anecdotal, and I've kind of been interested in exploring that in some kind of rigorous way, that there is a kind of clinicity that we've accepted in, and I'm circling around a few different terms, and so I don't want to use any of these as a buzzword that will fix your thinking, but I'm suspicious of the idea that you can't trust, or at least that in order to prove your own existence, you need to know that there are things that you can doubt. It's something that came up in a ThinkSpot stream that I was watching. Paul C. Maxwell is a Christian writer who was kind of talking about Hume and Descartes and a few other thinkers that were building this kind of idea that, I think, therefore I am, and thus there's this kind of like self-nullification that sometimes happens within very academic thought experiments. And I find myself trying to figure out what a person is doing when they have this, because personally I've experienced the idea of like trusting a spirit of fear as opposed to understanding that is not something that God wants me to have. And there's this kind of like dependence that you have on, and it's something also discussed, I think, in a great extent in the Ted Decker book, The Girl Behind the Red Rope. It was a reaction to it's kind of like a reaction to The Handmaid's Tale mixed with like The Village, a lot of those kind of like same themes. And what I thought was interesting was that there is a spirit that kind of represents Athena, like wisdom type part of the main character's psyche, and it was something it was represented as a older woman that only she could see. And then there were Furies who she was pretty sure were demonic entities, and were kind of one of the main antagonists in the novel. And
Yeah.
she was thus suspicious then when there was another spirit being that was a young boy who said some things that contradicted wisdom, and she wasn't sure whether there was any utility in listening to this young boy. And
Yeah.
but the boy said to her, "What if I could tell you that there was a way that you could not um, have to listen to fear anymore?" And it was a very, I think, interesting way of thinking about, wisdom as this thing that does have utility, but it doesn't provide all of the answers, and that kind of it kind of supported that idea that I told you before. C.S. Lewis brought up of, your rationality not being an infinite source of utility. It's not one of your strongest assets. Your passion turns out to be something that is actually more vital to your existence.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was
And that's clearly how people act in real life. That's the ebbs and flows of culture today have to do with the passions, and not that we should all become Stoics, but and even the Stoics get a bad rap. It's not that we should not have passions, but that we should learn, I guess, to master them in a way, or they'll master us, because they're definitely more powerful than our knowledge is. But that's also a way of understanding the world. So in reality,
yeah, I have been interested in that topic since learning for the first time about Eastern mysticism, and I think it was a lot of the Lord revealing to me different things about mysticism that I'd allowed myself to cling to within Christian thinking. And I've been on this road to kind of deprogram that things, but also looking for a way to put that into a fictional thing, because I think it's such an important thing to discuss, that the faculties that we have to ascertain, what is the highest spiritual good, are not necessarily something that we have innately, and we can sometimes hamstring ourselves to, be shocked every time, we, maybe we have a particularly egregious, sin or thought pattern that we reckon as sin, and then lo and behold, we're brought to this point of, at some point, desolation, where we realize, oh wait, that might not be something that I can actually fix. And I thought that was something that I could just flip a switch on and be done with. But it turns out there is something much more, there is a resource that's much more powerful than I am, and I need to invite that in, as opposed to put on my, thinking goggles and puff on my pipe and just like think that I'm going to ferret out in some quantifiable way.
Yeah. I mean, Christianity is the only religion that has the concept of demerited favor. That you deserve not favor, and yet you receive it. It's not every other religion, which is natural because it's something that humans naturally can understand and appreciate and define the world in terms of, is merited favor, where I earn my reward, but Christ teaches that you earn judgment, and he then he takes that judgment, and then he gives you his reward. Nothing else like that. So it's interesting. We'll have to do a stream at some point. I don't know. Maybe this gets too. We weren't going to make this like a Christian stream or anything, but that could be an interesting topic for another time. Is how that because you can see the hero's journey being about merited favor. Obviously, that's how we understand normal everyday practice. Is you do something good and then you get a reward. You do something bad and you don't get that that good thing. But how does that impact storytelling? I guess in light of, and we could think about the Inklings too. You know, how did they deal with this concept of demerited favor in their storytelling? All of the Inklings being the sort of people who were interested in exploring this worldview that they did have, that they were living within, but through a fantasy framework. So
Yeah,
I'm sure
I
they
think.
all have different answers to that sort of question.
Yeah, no, you bring up a good point, and I think it would be fruitful to have maybe some kind of thing that we put out that is more, just so that people can discern for themselves, what they're walking into, maybe. But
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
before we get off the topic, though, there is a book by Brennan Manning that I just started called The Ragamuffin Gospel, and it kind of goes
I've heard
into
of that.
this
Yeah.
into this thing that I'm seeing much more in the nonfiction I'm being shared with at my church, and it seems to be around that fundamentalist tip of like seeing what that that kind of and understanding what that unmerited favor principle is. So if there's anybody listening that's interested in that, I feel like that would be a good place to start. Um, but yeah, I think that there is much that fiction can do to at least start people on this uh, journey of discovering what the difference is between a dramatically poor Deus Ex Machina and living in a world where the power that you are able to access is not entirely yours. And it's in some ways, I think, like I've been trying to think of creative ways to change stories up in terms of where they start or where they end. It seems like the story circle that Dan Harmon created seems to be much more of like stressing or at least the video that I watched. Uh, the one thing that I really liked was the stress on the midpoint. Um, but it feels like stories that I enjoy really harp on. Like you can think of A New Hope in the Star Wars saga as like at some point he realizes that like when Obi-Wan is slain, oh crap, I need to be the Jedi. And there is some kind of, in my mind, a correlation to a kind of um, what would you call it, like a Pentecost type thing of like accepting a spiritual helper in a way. If in that kind of suggests to me that like you get some kind of spiritual awakening at that point. And it seems like there is among the conservatives that I listen to kind of like an uneven criticism of that type of thinking where, you know, like correctly enough, we don't want to be overly zealous to spirits that are not the Holy Spirit, that are like suggesting that there are certain things that are unbiblical. Like we want to be able to discern the spirits. But at the same time, there's a lot of very practical things that the Holy Spirit does to help us in that understanding work that we do. That I feel like fiction is able to represent because you can, I think, you can help someone discern things because you're taking them on a journey, and you're giving them a different, like, you're giving them the perspective that um, you feel led to give them. It's not necessarily you taking on the whole burden yourself to be like, I need to give them everything that they need to do their spiritual work, because that's not your job. um, but I
Yeah.
feel like it is, there are certain topics that, like, I feel led to do with Strider to kind of show what the hero's journey can do on that, um, in those in that work, um, to illustrate that a little bit.
Yeah. We'll need to okay, another future episode. We're going to talk about Charles Williams.
Oh, talk about who? I'm sorry, cut out a little bit.
Charles Williams.
Oh,
the strangest inkling.
Yes, yeah. My sister agrees with you.
Yeah, in a way. Well, I don't know my favorite. He wrote the most interesting stories, I think. He's the most He's technically the most talented fiction writer of the bunch, I think. Just not didn't find that market. In terms of talking about finding markets, he had a market of a few dozen people, including his fellow Inklings people. I think C.S. Lewis is one of his greatest fans. But,
oh, really?
A challenge to read, I guess. You have to enjoy. I guess if you took magical realism and you mixed it with Rosicrucianism and medieval, some more obscure medieval philosophical thought, it gets pretty bizarre. But it's some of the best stuff you can read from the 20th century, I think. But
I definitely want to talk about magical realism. That's something that I definitely have enjoyed imbibing
I bet.
past.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly something that we should do. I'll talk a little bit more after the show about administrative things.
Okay.
But it's been fun talking about click and mortar is what I call the episode, just to be extra cheeky.
It's been good. Yeah. Sorry for coming in late, but I'm glad I did the video this time.
Yeah.
It's nice to if you're gonna do video, I should do video too. People observe 2 videos.
And it seems like our decor matches a little bit with the blue walls.
Austere walls.
So thanks for everybody for who's joined us. Everyone's still in the chat that deigned to include us in your evening.
Thanks.
Next time for more talk of self-publishing and art and deep thinking.
Yeah, we do this every Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. So you can expect that, and we have a nice chat. So usually, and we tie in comics and storytelling in general, but we get pretty philosophical pretty quickly. So if you're into that, give us a sub and a like, and let your friends know what we're doing.
Thank you, Leo. We'll see you later.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for the endorsement.
Hey.
See you, Leo.